Let's see. If you're watching this later and you're not in Discord with us, I highly recommend checking Discord out. Bunch of smart people talking about smart people stuff like this, and way beyond, to be completely transparent. Theology, the Bible, culture, news, conspiracy, spirituality, science, entertainment. It's essentially just a what is the pro-social way to say this? A gathering of lovely people talking about interesting things. Discord is free. It will always be free. There's a link in the description of the video, and there is a link in the live chat that I need to pin, actually. So it will be pinned in the live chat. And we do a number of these live streams every week on several different YouTube channels. So one of them is the one you're watching this on right now. And that is my personal YouTube channel. That's where we do our Tuesday topic discussion. So if you do join Discord, in the announcement section every week, for the most part, we run a poll. And whatever wins the poll is what we talk about. Last week was Gnosticism. The week before was miracles. These are like random topics that we find interesting that we talk about. There is a voice channel in Discord for all of these streams where you can call in and chat, as long as you've been in Discord for a little bit and we've gotten to know you a little bit. But that is available. The rest of the live streams that you'll see on the events page on Discord, all of these, and it'll give you the link to the proper YouTube channel, Tattoo Theist, Live Bible Study. The other ones happen on Live Bible Study, and that is this YouTube. So go subscribe to that, where we read all kinds of texts and whatnot. So we just started the Book of Job on Sunday nights. On Thursdays, we're reading the Book of Giants. And then possibly, Saturday or Friday nights, we will be reading something else that is non-canonical. So on this past Saturday, we started reading the Gospel of Truth. This is a Nag Hammadi library text. So it was found relatively recently in the grand scope of things, and it's already pretty interesting. So all that happens on Live Bible Study. All the other live streams for Tuesday, the topic discussions, happen here. And then I've been trying to do some kind of academic breakdowns of different topics. So recently I went over some contradictions in the gospel, the longer ending of Mark, sola scriptura, and then a really interesting take on several passages of 1 Corinthians, where if you shift them around, because they're in different places in different early manuscripts, the context changes. And the outcome is just pretty interesting. Stuff like that. Tonight, though, we're talking about Marcion. Marcion's super interesting. And Marcion, many scholars assert, put together the first Bible ever. The first New Testament, to be specific. So we're going to chat about all that and a little bit more. There's some bonus stuff in here tonight. Hey, Ghost. Oh, look who it is. Hey, Mystic. How's baby stuff going, Mystic? I don't see you enough to harp on you about baby stuff. So update us on baby things. David. Good evening, all. Can't wait to sit back in my recliner with my wild cat and dog sleeping next to me as I learn new stuff from all of you. I love and admire all of you, David. We love and admire you. Guys, it snowed. Well, considering where you are, which I won't say, that's pretty wild. It was negative here today, and I work half the time outside. So I feel your pain. Unfortunately, we did not get snow. It's just brutal and miserable and cold. Great stuff. Good stuff. Discord's open, just so everybody knows. The voice thing is open. I'm listening in, but... Oh, Chanson. I'm listening in, but keeping the mic off. I have my kiddos this evening. Well, I do promise you that it will be pro-social. We will not say any naughty words. I assure you. In case you were worried. At least I won't. I can't speak for anybody else. But I think we are safe. At least for the most part. Mikkel. We're having another boy. And I'm finally not sick. I'm never taking eating for granted again. Well, that's good. That's a good thing, and that's very exciting. I'm as the kids would say, low key jealous because my house is all girls and is going to be more all girls. But we're just going to keep rolling until the boy comes, regardless of what Kat thinks about that. That's the plan, on board or not. All right, I'm going to give a disclaimer here so that we're all on the same page and so that I can be very transparent and honest. Biblical scholarship is a massive, ridiculous, sometimes comical world of disagreement, where we have many of the Bible-believing scholars who don't agree on much at all. Things pertaining to Christian history, theology, Christology, eschatology, any of the ology stuff is essentially at the core disagreed upon by the entirety of Christian scholarship. It just is what it is. It's the nature of the beast that they participate in. So I, like anybody else, including those scholars, to be super clear, I source everything that I learn and all the things that I know that I try to pass on to people. I source them from people that I trust personally. Obviously, I have a bias like anybody else does. But I can say I'm comfortable with these people. I'm comfortable with the fact that I've done what I always do and I aggregate. So I'll try to find opposing views. What do people who hate Marcion say about Marcion? Now, what do people who love Marcion say about Marcion? And I do my best to kind of bring that all together and devise what I think based off of that. So this is an aggregation of data, just like everything else. These primarily are from people who have quite literally dedicated their entire life's work to this very small niche of Christian scholarship that pertains to Marcion. It's a small group of people who have gone extremely deep into this and have attempted to reconstruct a lot of everything that surrounds Marcion. So just disclaimer, like always, I am who I am. I have the biases I have, but I've done my best, genuinely from the bottom of my heart, to try to have a neutral view on it. Like most things, don't really care. I don't really care. I just want to know what actually happened. I want to know what the truth is. I don't care what any of you guys think. As always, I just want to lay out some information and see where we get with that. Don't come for me when you know I can actively defend myself. Shame. Hey, Ruth. Okay, so first thing is some backstory so that we can kind of have like an image of what was the time? Like, when was Marcion? Before who was Marcion? Like everything else, it's hard to say. There are disagreements all over the place. There is, however, a kind of general consensus on some things. And so I've aggregated all of it. So some of it might seem contradictory, but it's because I want to give you both views and not just shove one opinion down your throat. So Marcion of Sinope, some pronounce it Sinope. The majority, from everything I know, is Sinope. But who knows, because I am the worst possible person to ever ask about how to properly pronounce something. Best we can tell, 85 to 160 AD was his zone of reality. He was born in Sinope, which was a port city south of the Black Sea, which would be Turkey, modern day. At the time, just for further context, this would be north of Galatia, if you know where that is. Perhaps that's not helpful, but if you do, it's just north of there. The Proto-Orthodox Christians, and in case you weren't here last week, the Proto-Orthodox is the way that scholars identify the first Christians. These were people that did not belong to denominations because they didn't really exist. You had some, but from their perspective, like, that wasn't real. You were either a Christian or you were a heretic. There wasn't like the Protestants and the Catholics, and they're all Christian, but they believe different things. There was none of that. There was Christian or heretic, period. So the Proto-Orthodox were the ones that were believed to be Christian, and these were the true Christians by merit of early theologians, which is already problematic, but we'll come back to that. So these Proto-Orthodox demonized Marcion to the point of him being associated with the term heresy, which coincidentally was synonymous essentially with Gnosticism, which we talked about last week. And again, if you weren't with us for that, I would recommend watching that after this, because little lights will go off, because I don't want to repeat things too much. But Gnosticism was a version of Christianity. They believed they were the true Christians. The proto-Orthodox, as we call them now, believed they were the true Christians. They both thought each other were heretical. And so the proto-Orthodox, the legit ones, quote unquote, called Marcion a heretic. He was a heretic, and associated him with Gnosticism. Now, when you get into Marcion, what he actually believed, there's no way to logically put him in the condition of a Gnostic, because he just didn't believe those things. There were some similarities, but to call him a Gnostic is just dishonest. And that is objective, I would say. I think it's objective among all scholars. I don't really hear any modern scholars anymore using the term Gnostic to describe Marcion. One of the most important early theologians was Irenaeus. Important in a negative way, because Irenaeus was popular, prominent, listened to, or read, because he was a writer. He condemned Marcion the same as he did the Gnostic Gospels. He was also, during this time, one of the loudest, most outspoken against Gnosticism. He was a huge part of what won the rhetoric war of Gnosticism becoming heresy, the two terms becoming synonymous with one another. So he would tell people not to read the Gnostic texts and to view Marcion as nothing but a heretical lunatic, lumping them together because that's what these early Christians did. If you didn't align with what they believed, you were just a heretic. And oftentimes were called a Gnostic, even if you did not believe Gnostic theology, or even if you wouldn't fit cleanly in that boat. Many scholars believe Marcion may have been a member of the Jewish community, not a pagan, as he was called, because what better way to demonize somebody during that time than call them a pagan? And that's what a lot of the detractors claimed, was that he was pagan. However, this is one of these times where it's very unclear. Some scholars say that he was from the Jewish community. Others say, no, he was a Gentile. So these are opposite things, and it changes some of the story context. I tend to lean towards that perhaps he was a part of the Jewish community, so I'm going to read the rest of his life story from that perspective, just to be, again, totally transparent. I believe it makes sense, so I run with that. But I am keenly aware that there's a possibility he was a Gentile. Marcion owned and ran a ship business, or a shipping business. The specifics of the business, we don't really know. But contextually, scholars have been able to gather kind of a story that would make sense based on other things. So some of these scholars speculate that he owned a number of ships, and what he did was probably rented them out, specifically, potentially, to the Roman government. So as Sinope was a core center of the Roman Navy, it would make sense then that Marcion, owning a shipping company, would rent to the government. He would rent these ships to Rome to use for whatever purposes. We know that he moved at one point to Rome sometime around 130, which is important because of the Jewish war. So sometime around 130, in order to create a didascalia, which was like you can like picture it as a classroom teaching, which makes sense again contextually with some of the other things he was doing and his kind of kick towards Christianity. From this, many have concluded that he had already begun writing about the traditions and the teachings of Jesus, and that perhaps that's what he was trying to teach. That was his angle and the topic of why he was trying to do this, which at the time was still a largely Jewish tradition. So in this early part of Christianity, Christianity was still very Jewish, which takes you into a lot of the rabbit holes about the Gospels and why, as time went on in the Gospels, authorship-wise, like when they were published, so Mark being first, Matthew and Luke coming later, and John being last, why there seems to be a significant and consistent rise in Jewish elements in the Gospels as time goes on. Mark having very little, Matthew and Luke being identical in many ways, having more, and then John having quite a bit, and John also is just kind of wild in a bunch of other ways too. But remembering that the early Christians were very much enthralled with Jewish traditions still, which you can also take notes from Paul in his epistles, where he's kind of on everybody's butt about we don't do this anymore. This isn't what we do. Things are different now. He's obviously writing to churches that are still largely practicing Jewish tradition while being under a Christian label. So he seemed to have begun these writings back in Sinope, which had a very important Jewish Greek-speaking community. Contextually important and otherwise. Aquila, not the one you're thinking of, was one of the revisers of the Jewish Bible, and that individual lived there. So what many assume is that Marcion and that, let's call it a scholar, lived there. And so they were in close proximity to one another. So a scholarly assumption then is that Sinope had more than that they had a vibrant community, a vibrant population of very scripturally interested individuals, highly educated people, because that's really the only people who wrote at this time. Most people didn't write. A lot of people still didn't read. It was getting better for sure, but you were on the up and up if you were able to write. And if you were able to translate, you were obviously kind of at the top of the game. But specifically with these people who are scripturally interested, those who had a very deep understanding of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. We can picture Marcion having been involved and interconnected to this culture, which makes a lot of sense as we see some of the things that happen moving forward. Now, story-wise, backing way up, what else is going on at the time in the place? In Rome during this period, people are going through the largest revolt against the Roman occupation that had ever happened. So Bar Kokhba, there was a revolt in 135 that he led. This was a literal war, and it lasted about 3 years. The way that it ended, the way it concluded, was in a way where both groups lost dramatically. You could kind of look at it. It's not a great representation, but kind of like what's going on in the East right now, where we have this war. I don't really want to say the words, but everybody here is smart, so you know what I'm talking about. Both sides are just being decimated. This is a similar thing. One side will still come out on top, but both sides are suffering such dramatic losses that it is a loss for both sides. Big picture. The downstream results of this was a drastic and dramatic mix in the sociological makings. Like, you had this massive mix of peoples, of types of peoples, culture. In Israel, Bar Kokhba would later become a messiah figure, literally. And the interesting and sad thing about it was that a lot of Christians got on board with it. So there were a lot of early Christians who backed him and this whole messiah thing. We know from Justin Martyr, who is really prominent, and maybe we can talk about him at some point, but Justin Martyr left us an understanding that it seemed the Christians who did not side with Bar Kokhba were put under wild restrictions or were sentenced to death. So this would be kind of the opposite of what we talk about with a lot of early Christians, where a lot of these early Christians were totally willing to die for their faith and for what they believed and knew to be true. This is a good example of, well, it wasn't all of them. It wasn't all of them. There were some that were not willing to die for what was true and were not willing to die for what they believed in. Let's like this thing now. You know it's already going to be good. David, you're lovely. Thank you for being there for me when I fail. Patricia, it's good to see you. Yeah, super glad you made it. So Marcion in Sinope, he's an entrepreneur who likely relies on the Roman government to conduct business in order to sustain himself. This is how he makes money. This is how he survives. So this war would be impactful to him, both personally and also culturally, because this was affecting his literal life and it was affecting his business. So it's a very personal deal for him. He's watching what's happening. He's watching Rome and the Jewish culture basically go to war and completely decimate each other. That's the perspective. He would be seeing that the Jewish revolt from his perspective, possibly being from the Jewish community, possibly not, but possibly from the Jewish community. He's seeing it from that perspective. He's watching the Jewish people engage in this war, likely causing wild damage to him personally, but definitely to society. So he's being impacted. That just needs to be in frame because it makes other things make sense. So he is suffering from this war personally, as is his culture sociologically. The results of the war, among other things, included two things, basically. The loss of several of Rome's armies, prominent, big deals. The only reason they won is because they had neighboring cultures come to their aid. So had they not had that, they would have been in trouble. Possibly would have changed the outcome. The other thing is that the Jews were then banished from Jerusalem. So they lost their holy place. They lost something wildly significant to their religious function. It was then made into a Roman devotion, a place of devotion, which is just kind of an insult to injury. And it's not the only time something like that happened. There are other examples that at some point we'll talk about. Snake to the dome should just be a given at this point. You misspelled let's like this thing now before Father Joe gets another snake to the dome. Got it. I am now up to speed. Yes, Marcion was a merchant. Not bad at all. No, we're the true Christians. Marcion was a economic gangster, basically. Not really, but he obviously did pretty well for himself. It seems relatively clear that he did well for himself. He was a relatively well-to-do kind of guy. Alrighty, so Marcion could be assumed to have seen all of what was going on. The defeat, in a sense, for both sides. Marcion could have watched it, lived it, and then made a connection to what the Jews had gone through here to what they had gone through in the scriptures, in the Septuagint, in the Old Testament. Because again, perspective-wise, the New Testament does not exist at this point. It's not a thing. There is no collection or compilation of Christian texts. There are just texts kind of wandering and floating around. But up until this point, everything was passed orally. That's where we are. So he saw what happened in the Old Testament scriptures, and now potentially has made some kind of like personal connection to what is going on now. He could have seen this as the embodiment of God or Yahweh, and what had resulted here due to this religion, and what had resulted in the Old Testament due to this religion. Lots of war, lots of death, lots of destruction. What happened here is reminiscent of the Exodus and a number of other things in the Old Testament. The death of thousands of soldiers in the name of God, along with everything else that happens during war in the name of God, if it is a religious war. Perhaps this is why Marcion then decides to dig into the Old Testament. Why he decides, like, this is going to be something I get involved in. I want to understand more. What happened here is Marcion went in search of the God or Messiah that was often spoken about, what was being passed around, what was being talked about orally, and some documents floating around, but nothing official yet. None of that had been written yet. Marcion saw a new Torah. That's what he seems to be going after, is what should this actually be? We have the Septuagint, we have the Old Testament in Greek. This God, something seems off. And now seeing this Jewish war now, it seems consistent with the Old Testament, the behavior, the outcomes, the pain, everything. He was searching for something different. The new Torah is how it's described, based on the Sermon on the Mount. That was a big deal. The Sermon on the Mount, the story of it. A God who teaches when you are struck to do not strike back. If Rome hits the Jews should not hit back. He seemingly found this new Torah in what would be the character of Jesus Christ. So Marcion kind of diverts his attention to this character, these stories that are being told about Jesus Christ. Marcion did, however, see what many of us see without wanting to really admit it, or you don't see, and that's fine. But some of us do. I've voiced it many times, so I personally do. But Marcion seems to have seen that there was some kind of something in the way between Yahweh of the Old Testament and Jesus Christ of the New Testament. He seemed to think that there was something different about them. In fact, Marcion went much further and completely denied Yahweh. He denied the Old Testament entirely as having anything to do with the character of Jesus Christ. And therefore, he abandons the Old Testament as a text altogether. He gets rid of it, which is important as Marcion begins to do what he's going to do. He sought to replace what was the vengeful in his perception, the vengeful deity of the Old Testament, with what seems to be, from his perspective, the rational and compassionate deity of the New Testament. To replace the deity who told its people to fight and take revenge on its enemies with the deity who taught how to live in communion with them. This is, by all accounts, it's the driver for Marcion. Like, this is what gets him in. It doesn't make sense to him. And so he's trying to seek sense. He's trying to seek how to make it make sense. Now, before the actual New Testament stuff, an overview of Marcion and early Christianity. This, being fair, I compiled largely from detractors. So a lot of this will be negative, and there will be some contradiction, and that is intentional, and we can talk about it if anybody wants to. So was Marcion like Lee Strobel unopposed? Kind of. Just evaluating the Gospels. Kind of. Save that. Remember that, because we're going to go super deep into all that. But first, I want to be fair. So here's some of just things about Marcion, things about the compilation, all that stuff, but largely from sources that did not like him. One of the biggest things was dualism, which is similar to Gnosticism. We talked about that last week. But dualism and the rejection of the Old Testament. Marcion taught that the God of the Old Testament, whom he is reported to have called the Demiurge, there is argument about this, whether the term was used or not, because this is largely tied to Gnosticism, was a distinct, inferior, and wrathful deity who focused on law, justice, and judgment. Also, he contrasted this deity, Yahweh, with God, in his perspective, who is Jesus of the New Testament, who he believed was a higher, benevolent God of love, grace, mercy, that then is revealed through Jesus Christ. So I'll save that. But that's it. Yahweh, bad. Jesus, good. Yahweh, evil, in a sense, from his perspective. Jesus is pure. Grace, love, mercy, compassion, benevolence. Creation of his own canon, which we're going to go in massive depth on. But these are some of the things like you'll get if you Google things. You'll find these. Marcion rejected the Hebrew scriptures. We talked about that entirely, completely. He then compiles what he considers to be the true Christian canon, consisting of, and what is arguably the first Christian canon, which consists of 10 of Paul's epistles. He does not include the pastoral epistles, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. And he heavily edited version of Gospel of Luke, with this is what you'll be told, is that it's stripped of the Jewish elements. The argument to that, from the other side, is that the truth seems to be that Luke and the other Gospels took from Marcion. So rather than, like you got here, he wrote a Gospel and he heavily edited the Gospel of Luke, taking out Jewish elements. What seems to be the truth is the opposite. It seems to be that Marcion had this text, or these texts, and they were taken from him. He was used as a source, not the other way around. Meaning, and I mentioned it earlier, that it seems some of the Gospels injected Jewish elements. Marcion didn't remove them. They were added later. Obviously, a lot of argument about it. Emphasis on Paul. This is important and this is super true. Marcion viewed the Apostle Paul as the only true interpreter of Jesus' teachings and gospel. Remembering, and I'm sorry if it's annoying, but remembering there is no New Testament. There is no Bible. You have the Septuagint for Greek people here, people who speak Greek. You have the Septuagint, and then you have some obscure, impossible to nail down and understand, some writings being passed around. Very flippantly. Nothing official. Nothing clear. Nothing confident. You primarily have these stories being told. The only thing besides that you have, and it's why Marcion probably put so much emphasis on it, is you have Paul's epistles. You have 10 epistles, and then you have the pastoral epistles, which honestly today still a large portion of scholarship rejects and say it was not Paul. They're either forgeries, they might have been somebody who knew Paul, but they're absolutely not written by Paul. As well as a couple others. Scholarship today, like the consensus from what I understand, is that 7 of Paul's epistles are seen as absolutely written by Paul. 7. Meaning 3, no. And pastoral epistles, no. Which is important to understand. And if you really read, truly read, you can feel it. We've talked about it a bit going through some of the New Testament stuff earlier this year, or last year, I guess. But Marcion loved Paul. And probably because he had the text, he had these epistles, he had this data to go off of. And Paul did not teach largely Jewish stuff. Paul was very much about like, this is the new covenant. Why are you guys still doing that stuff? We don't do that anymore. We are not under the law. Jesus fulfilled the law. You're defeating the purpose of what Jesus did. Paul was all about that heavily with these early Christian churches. So it makes sense why Marcion gravitated towards that, because that's what Marcion saw as the truth as well, is that we are not that. Marcion took it a bit further. Paul would quote the Old Testament. Paul was not a scholar, but man, he was super educated in the Old Testament. Very educated for that time. So Marcion differed from Paul in that way. But Paul was very anti, let's drag Jewish tradition into the Christian church. And so Marcion gravitated towards him probably because of that. Lee Strobel. Don't make fun of Lee Strobel, because I'm trying to convince Kat to read The Case for Christ as an entry level. Get a grip on some of the most common apologetic angles that people do. The original New Testament. That's what I believe. That's my very subjective opinion. Was Thomas Jefferson channeling Marcion with the Bible he wrote? It's giving me Jefferson vibes. Maybe I'm jumping the gun. We'll see. See what you think after we read the rest of it. It's crazy how many different doctrines or ways to believe things within Christianity. I'm having a mind-blown moment. It's even worse than that. But we will talk about it. Leo Tolstoy also wrote his own version of the Gospel of Jesus, stripped of all the miraculous elements. Interesting. I've never read that. Oh, I got Mere Christianity too. I have that already. I want her to have some of the very cookie cutter stuff, because she'll be able to very easily see this is silly, and then move on to something else. Something we do at night now is we read Jesus Calling, and then I completely destroy Jesus Calling, and then we have a deep theological conversation for the next hour, and it's been one of the greatest things that we've ever done together. It's been very good. It's been very nice. But I want to do the same thing with A Case for Christ. I want, the context is good to start other conversations. Very mind-boggling, over 30,000 sects under Christianity. Yeah, I think what's the actual number? It's 44,000 or something. All right, moving on. Emphasis on Paul, super important. The view of Jesus. Marcion taught that Jesus was not born of a woman. I'm going to read that again. Marcion taught that Jesus was not born of a woman and did not possess a physical body, aligning with a docetic view of Christ. He believed Jesus appeared in a spiritual form and was sent by the higher God to free humanity from the tyranny of the Old Testament deity. This is heavily disagreed upon, which is why I included it. I don't know any of the scholars that I very deeply and obsessively follow who would ever express this way. So I don't know where this comes from. Probably one of the early theologians, but just understand that's not widely accepted. From what I know, it's not widely accepted. Condemnation by the church. Marcion's teachings were condemned as heretical by the Proto-Orthodox Church, including figures such as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Hippolytus. His rejection of the Old Testament and his theological dualism were particularly controversial, which is fair enough. Now, the gospel stuff. I've been straying away from my spirituality lately. I don't know why. I'm so grateful for y'all. Low-key, no pressure, you know. Don't do that. This is something Kat and I have been talking about a lot recently too. Is like, what if you found out that the gospels we have are not the gospels we're supposed to have? Would it truly destroy like what you believe? Would it change anything really? For me, it would not. If I found out that virgin birth was not a thing, it would change nothing for me. If I found out walking on water was not a real thing, it would change nothing for me. If you take one of these things away or a few of these things away, but then accept all the rest of them, it's still miraculous as could be. If you took away the virgin birth and we're like, okay, well, virgin births were something that were common in the ancient world. So maybe this was something that was added to add context. Maybe this was a mistranslation of Isaiah, which I recorded a video going over the virgin birth. I'm going to post it in the next few days. But there's talk about the translation, all this stuff. But regardless, the point is, if you find out the virgin birth was not legitimate, that's not actually what happened. It's something that was added later for whatever reason. Does it change anything else Jesus did? Does it change any of the things with demons? Does it change the solid teaching that he was giving? Even if you took away a few of the miracles, would it change anything else? What if you took away everything except for the resurrection? Still pretty wild. Still pretty insane. What if you took away the resurrection but nothing else? Walking on water? Healing the blind? Like, it wouldn't change. It's still miraculous. It's still like something is wild and happening right now. That's how I like to explain when we talk about like the Gospels, because people get very defensive of, well, it all has to be true. Everything has to be true. It has to be exactly what I was taught in Sunday school. If I find out anything wasn't exactly as it was, my faith is going to be destroyed. It's very silly. It's very silly. And like, it's a great example of how people have become indoctrinated. We know there are mistakes. There's no disagreement in like the scholarly world. The Bible contains mistakes. There's a lot of reasons to believe that we don't have what we should. We know there were epistles that we don't have. So if the Bible was meant to come to us perfect, it didn't. So it's just something like we have to grasp as a people and be like, okay, well, why? Well, if free will actually reigns, that's why. Anything could happen and anything did happen. People are butchering Christianity today. They were butchering it from the very beginning. It shouldn't change what you believe or your faith in general. And that wasn't all directed at Patricia, by the way. She said, I'm at a weird point where I don't know what to believe, or like I just don't feel firm in things lately. I just think I have a really hard time with the resurrection. That's the main part I struggle with. So still, it's just something you need to think about. What if the resurrection was not true? What if just that thing didn't happen, but everything else was legitimate? It still like defies all reality. It defies a lot. The resurrection's a pretty key point to be fair. But you'd still have to kind of wrestle with, well, how did he do everything else then? Why was that? And obviously there's a lot more to that. If you haven't really gone into apologists who are actually good at what they do talk about the resurrection, I would recommend doing that. There's decent evidence for the resurrection. There's decent evidence for it. But we'll never actually know. You can never have absolute confidence. Like, part of this is just faith. Because we just don't have like the ability to see it. Like, we could see things today. We have video and stuff today. Like, show me one video of that and I'm sold. Up until AI, and now it's a total crapshoot again. But for a long time, it's like if you had a picture or a video, then it happened. Proof, good. We just don't have that. We have these puzzle pieces all over the place that have been scattered and intentionally burned and lied about and rewritten. We have the best we have. But I think there's decent evidence for it. It's tough, though. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm down. Because I obviously struggle with everything. I struggle with literally all of it. 100% of it. Salvation Zone says there are mistakes because Satan knows the Bible. The Bible's the truth, so he's been tinkering with it. Quran is unchanged because a kingdom divided will not stand. He would never want to change his lies in Quran. I get what you're saying, but it's not true. Like, it's not, I get what you're saying, and on principle, I'm with you, but like the Quran has gone through revisions as well. The Quran has mistakes as well. The Quran is also a compilation of texts that has been altered throughout history. We don't have any ancient compilation of text that was not altered because that's just the way they worked. You had manual scribes where that's their life. You had scribes intentionally change things. You had scribes on accident change things. You had very nefarious things happen, and then you had innocent things happen. But it's just the way the world works. David said, if you believe Jesus is God, then nothing can shake your faith. Right? That's one of the biggest things, is that part of the reason that I don't really care, like the Bible, I don't care. It changes nothing for me because I feel that I've truly experienced God. Like, I don't doubt that God exists. I doubt that us as humans have documented the history accurately. I 100% doubt that. But I don't doubt God at all. At all. I know that. Like, that is something I would die for. But to say the Bible is inerrant, I would not die for that. I would not lay down my life to say the Bible is perfect and unaltered and without error and logical, and that we have everything we should in the text. I would not die for that because I don't believe that. But I would certainly die for what I believe. I would die for the concept of God, without a doubt. Mikkel said, it's good to wrestle with your beliefs, with your faith. Patricia, dare I say it is spiritually healthy? I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary. If you're an honest person and you're halfway intelligent, in my opinion, and who the hell am I? But in my opinion, you should struggle with your faith consistently until you die. If it ever just becomes super easy, I'd say like you're not really studying. You're just kind of floating through life. You're just maybe praying and going about your life. But if you're actually trying to learn, like if you're doing what we do here, what we do, like what our group does together is brutal. It's every week is like a challenge. All of this type of information is really rough because it forces you to see that probably what you were taught is not exactly accurate. It doesn't make what you believe not accurate. It means we were all taught things that were not quite true. So you should. I think it's really positive. It means you're actually like learning things, and it means you're actually trying and you're growing. I don't know how else you do that. If you're not moving forward, you're moving backward. I don't think you can stand still spiritually. You're either going forward or backward. Ruth said, I've struggled so much with my faith. I would assume that everybody in this group specifically has consistently struggled with faith. I don't think there are any brainwashed people in our group. People who are just like frolicking through a field of flowers, happy and confident every day. I don't think that. I'd be surprised to find out, I guess. Michelle Taylor. The good soil, the narrow gate, few seek good news equals good rumor. I don't quite get that. but I'm also not that bright. Ghost replied to someone, who was that? Oh, Salvation Zone, and said there used to be multiple versions of the Quran up until about 100 years ago. Yeah, my understanding is that that's been destroyed many times too. I don't think it's really any different. Till the day I die, Mikkel. Wisdom never has an endpoint. That's good. That's very good. Field of dreams and flowers and snakes in the playground. Well said. Okay, well, now that we've had all that fun and everybody's severely theologically troubled, let me destroy your life. So take everything I've said up until this point over the past 5 minutes as a preface that none of this should change what you believe, like your faith, but it should change what you think. It should force you to think differently. And if you land where you already are, cool, awesome. And if you don't and you need somebody to talk to, then any of us would be happy to talk. And we can go deeper into this. I'm thinking about doing the Gospels next Tuesday. And just because I don't want to leave you guys hanging with this, because it gets tough. I should find the Shroud of Turin documentary and also look up resurrection apologetics. You definitely should. If you want any like books or anything too, then send me a DM on Discord. I have a library, so I can make some recommendations. And same with the apologists. I could get you that stuff too. Divine law is necessary and eternal. It cannot be changed by any human or divine action. Hence, miracles, which by definition are violations of divinely created laws of nature, are impossible. I'm not even going to try. But I'm excited to see what somebody else says to that. That's really good. That's good stuff. I would definitely want to respond to that in Discord when I can think about it more and I'm not in New Testament history brain. So did Marcion compile the first New Testament? A few things first. The Gospel of Mark, as I mentioned earlier, was the first. This is the first gospel. Matthew and Luke are, by many scholars, seem to be nearly mirrors of one another. And then John is much later. Matthew and Luke are extremely similar. And in many places, I think it's actually like up to 85 or 90% are the same. There are just little things that are different. What this means, all of that, Mark being first, then Matthew and Luke, then John. What this means is that Mark is different from Matthew, Luke, and John. John is different from Matthew, Luke, and Mark, but Luke and Matthew are identical in many ways, literally, and then are similar in other ways, in the ways that they are not identical. The way that scholars have always made sense of Matthew and Luke being almost identical in many ways is by creating within scholarship this theoretical gospel that is referred to as Q. So if you ever listen to scholars or you read something and you see that they're referring to something called Q, it's the Q gospel. That's what they're referring to. And so when I use Q moving forward, that's what I'm talking about. Q is derived from the word quella, which literally just means source. So what they're saying is that Matthew and Luke had a source that they were writing off of. They were copying. They were doing what scribes do and pulling, but they were intentionally adding. And it's not to say it was malicious. It's just to say that they were both using the same source and then putting their own personality into the text. So Matthew putting more Matthew into it, but it wasn't actually written by Matthew, and Luke putting more Luke into it. I hope that makes sense, and if it doesn't, let me know. I can back up and try to say it in a different way. But Q is an unknown source. We don't have it. It's theoretical, just based on reconstructions that scholars do because of Matthew and Luke, but also others that we'll talk about. This Q gospel that we don't have seems to be the primary source for a number of texts that they're pulling from this Q gospel, this quella, this unknown source. The theory, widely accepted by New Testament scholars, is that there was a gospel source that is not surviving today, that the early authors used as a source. It is assumed that the author of Matthew and Luke both used Q to write their gospel. And this is why so much of one mirrors the other. The idea is that Mark and Q were the earliest two sources. However, with Mark being the only surviving one, and Q being theoretical because we don't have it, but scholars believe it existed. Meaning later Gospels likely used definitely Q, but seemingly Mark in other places too, as a reference, as a source to write their Gospel. So what about Marcion? Matthias Klinghardt is a scholar. He discovered that if we take Marcion's Gospel and compare it with the four canonical Gospels, we can see that the need for Q, this theoretical Gospel, becomes obsolete. It's irrelevant, making the hypothesis that Marcion is Q, because Marcion fills the gaps. The Q Gospel switched with Marcion, everything makes sense. This, like everything else, is not entirely agreed upon, though, as it would pose other problems for the canon. So I'd say this in a different way. This theoretical gospel that was being used as a reference or a source for Matthew and Luke for sure, but likely John in some places too, and in other texts that we'll talk about in a minute, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, several of these other early Christian texts use Q that we don't have as their source. Marcion scholars, people who are in that world, have done the work required to try to see if Marcion fits Q. And it seems, although not agreed upon, it seems as though Marcion does fit Q, which would make sense if Marcion wrote the first New Testament. It would make sense that Marcion had gathered, found, heard of the stories that were being passed around, both orally and whatever documents were being passed around at the time, compiled a gospel, because he had one gospel, Paul's 10 letters. That became the New Testament. Later gospel writers used that text as a source. We know that we don't have a surviving Gospel of Marcion because everybody hated Marcion, just like the Gnostics, and everything got burned and destroyed, which is why we don't have it. It just so happens that we've always been talking about Q, this gospel that we don't have, and he fits the bill. So it's very likely, this is my opinion now, because I'm on this side. Bias. I believe it makes perfect sense that Marcion is Q. Because just logically, Occam's razor. For Marcion to not be Q, you have to do a lot of work to be like, no, there's no way. You have to do very little work to say, yes, that makes sense. And it's a lot. And I know. The biggest reason, in my opinion, that scholars who don't agree with that, the reason they don't want to agree with that is because if we do that, it poses problems for other canonical texts. Consistency issues, which the Bible is already full of. The New Testament is full of consistency issues. But if Q is Marcion, it causes more issues, because then even more doesn't quite fit right. More things suddenly become clear as being, why is that there? Where did that come from? It opens a lot of doors. I'm going to read real quick just in case I upset anybody. That's why I jokingly call or label myself a Markan. I'm with you. What? Whoa. This is the meat of the live right now. Yes, it definitely is. After the posturing and hiding in plain sight. After the hiding in plain sight. That was the weirdest autocorrect ever. Mikkel said, now hearing it from you, Joe, it clicks. Makes sense to me. Mark's gospel coming first, then Marcion being the original author of the Gospel of Luke, then Matthew's gospel taking from Marcion's and Mark. Right. It's really interesting because when I first went through all of this, my brain exploded. And then I went through all of it again, years ago. I went through all of it again, and I'm like, oh, this all makes perfect sense. Everything that has bothered me, my entire life in Christianity, and like specifically on this side of things, it all just is like, oh, got it. I wish somebody would have just told me this a long time ago. This all makes perfect sense. My brain's currently exploding. I'm sorry, but hopefully this will make it better. And if it doesn't make it better, it will make it much worse. We'll see. Oh, so Ghost said, so is Q or Marcion paraphrasing Mark? How do those particular words end up on the page? In part, but like it's not, I wouldn't say that Marcion's gospel, which we don't have, is a reconstruction of Mark. It seems to have taken from whatever was floating around. So if you look at it like this, if we have a really hard time today thinking of the New Testament and thinking of the Bible as not being like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Paul's epistles, and then a few other texts. We have a really hard time with that. It takes, and maybe it's just me, but I have a really hard time with that. When you blank all of that information out, you know nothing. There's no Bible. It does not exist. We have an Old Testament. The only thing that is out there is oral tradition. So you have these Gnostics, you have these proto-Orthodox, you probably have a few other kind of sects of Christianity, but nothing prominent, who are all telling stories and having church services. And during all of that, most of these people can't read or write. So Jesus's followers were not writing anything. They couldn't write. Most of them could not read. Plus, this is much later. We're talking 40 to 70 beyond years later. We know that based on these texts, we know that some things were being passed around on paper, but that was it. So the like common assumption is that Marcion, because of where he was and who he was kind of clicked in with, had compiled from someone somewhere, maybe aggregated from a number of different sources, what then became his gospel. So what it was, if you picture it, is like, and some of it was probably oral, but Marcion's sitting at a desk in his room, and he gets dropped off like, 3 pieces of paper that tell some stories about Jesus. Somebody else brings another piece of paper. It's got a miracle of Jesus. Somebody else brings something else. It's the Sermon on the Mount. And he has this data that he then puts together and is like, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It has who Jesus was. It has the miracles he performed. It is a comprehensive, as much as it could be, who is Jesus Christ? This is the new Torah. That's how I picture it, is he just had these things kind of file in. He also heard some stories, so he wrote them down. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that seems to be like the easiest way to conceptualize it. And so then he creates the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then he's, for whatever reason or however, he got the epistles of Paul, and he's like, these should go in here too. So he's got the gospel, and he's got the 10 letters of Paul rejecting the pastoral epistles. I hope that makes better sense. I'd love a timeline diagram or something. It's challenging to visualize. I can definitely find you that, for sure. And if not, I can make one. I'm like that too. And then once I see things on a timeline, everything kind of clicks together. But I can definitely either find you one or make you one. Based on listening to Joe's description, it seems like Mark was paraphrasing Marcion, if Marcion is the original text. Possibly. Or perhaps they were right about the same time. I think personally, Mark was probably already out there. It seems that Mark was out there. And so Marcion maybe had access to it, maybe didn't. But if he did, he probably used most or all of it. And then whatever else he had compiled, whatever else he had received. And then put together this gospel. And then later we see Matthew and Luke, as well as the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter. Some of these non-canonical texts seem to pull from that gospel Q. So if we believe that's Marcion, they're pulling from Marcion's gospel. All the while, Marcion is being demonized to the point that we don't have the text. And this was like this was a popular dude. Marcionites became a thing. That's how much people hated him. You have to really hate someone to destroy their existence. And that's what happened. Very similar to the Gnostics. But we have some surviving Gnostic texts. Then why do most scholars reject this theory? Which part of the theory? and who scholars. Otherwise, I cannot help. Then there's a huge demand to elaborate on the backstory of this resurrected, anointed Jewish Messiah. I mean, yeah, there is a need. Paul's epistles, then Mark or Marcion, get to work to elaborate more on Jesus' story. That's how I see it. Yeah. That's what seems to make the most sense to me, personally. This is definitely something everybody should research themselves, like figure out what you think. It's not an easy one. Maybe Marcion is Mark. I don't think so, but it could be. It could be. But I don't think so. I think Mikkel's kind of hitting it there, the way I see it. As we had the Pauline epistle, just to, I guess, for anybody who doesn't know, the Gospels were significantly later than Paul's epistles. I feel like a lot of people think that Paul's epistles were after because the Gospels are in the beginning. Almost as if you learn nothing from the Old Testament where it's out of order. The New Testament is out of order too. So the Gospels were later. Paul is the closest, earliest of anything we know of about Jesus Christ. Like, Paul's it. That's relevant. Paul's it. So these epistles happen. So Christianity is already blooming. Like, the way has begun and has split, which is why Paul's pissed off at all these different churches. That's the zoomed out version, right? So, but most of these people can't read and write. No, there's nobody that we know of. There's no surviving text from that time beyond Paul's epistles. But you could definitely make the assumption that things were being written. So then it's a matter of where did they go? And some scholars believe Marcion got them. If not Marcion, then Q is something else. But either way, these are texts that we should have that we do not have. These are texts that were absolutely used by the gospel writers that we do have, and we don't have the original text. Whether you think it's Marcion or not is irrelevant. There was an earlier text that was being used as a source and seemingly being copied word for word in many places. Marcion or not, it's significant. It's very significant. So before we end the pod, how do prophetic patterns like Jonah, Isaiah, and a lot of other Messiah foreshadowing in the Old Testament get explained by Marcion? That's my biggest confusion. That's a lot. That's a lot. We could make that a whole nother talk, to be completely honest, because that goes into a lot of other things. Like, that goes into the video I just did on the virgin birth. I haven't posted it yet, but it goes into, like, the reality is of maybe some of these things also were not as they seemed. Maybe some things were misaligned or misconnected. It just kind of depends. But we maybe do a whole talk on that and going through it, like, each of them individually. Maybe that would be good. That would be interesting. I'd be down to do that because I still have a bit here and we're already running late. Michelle Taylor, seems like Marcion is late, way too late to be Q. So far, the best I can find, the Proto-Matthew was written first in Hebrew. Mark is a Greek anti-gospel. No resurrection in earliest. Luke was polished, non-eyewitness, embellished. Matthew, John was written later after the temple was sacked. The word gospel means good news, and the Hebrew good news translates to good rumor. I'm a bit confused about exactly what you're saying. I don't agree with the parts that I understand, but I also feel like maybe I'm not grasping the greater message. If you want to try to retype some of that, I'd try to respond. C said, I mean, you can steelman the argument for why... Can you steelman the argument for why Marcion's gospel doesn't predate the canonical gospels? Why it doesn't? Well, no. No, I cannot. Can you steelman the argument for why Marcion's gospel doesn't predate the canonical gospels? No, because I don't think it would make sense at all. So I would have a hard time doing that. I guess to be fair here, if not Marcion, someone else. That's the best I can give you, is that I don't think there's any reason at all to believe that something wasn't first, that we no longer have. That's the best I could do. So again, like I said a minute ago, throw Marcion out completely. I don't care. I'm not a Marcionite. Throw him out completely. There was something that was being copied by the canonical Gospels. There was something that was being copied by other texts. There was something that was being copied that we do not have. Copied and then added to. Two of which, if not more, are in the canonical scriptures. So that would be the best I could do. I don't think there's any way to justify that there wasn't something earlier that was being taken from, data-wise. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. I'm having a hard time understanding Michelle, and I do apologize. Maybe I'm just being dull. But again, Q is a mystery and will remain mystery, or who knows. Right, the only way it wouldn't is if like we uncover something, which isn't crazy to think, because I mean, we have the Nag Hammadi library that was not that long ago, less than 100 years. So it's quite possible that something gets found. That would do it, or that would help, at least. It'd be another puzzle piece. Like, the Christian history is a massive puzzle that I don't think there's any world in which we actually find all of the pieces. But the more pieces we find, the more we can be like, oh, that's a mountain. That's the sea. There's a boat right there. And we have very little right now. Steve says, okay, thank you. It's the best I could do. So I'm sorry if you're being sarcastic. It's the best I could do. I don't care who it is, but there was something first, in my humble opinion. Okay, I'm going to try to jam through the rest of this quick. We might have to save some of it, actually. There's quite a bit left. Maybe we do a part 2, and we go into some of the stuff Ghost was asking about. So I'm going to save Ghost's comment here. And we will do a part 2 to this one. Because I don't have enough time to go through the rest of this. And we kind of stopped at a decent place. So we'll do this next week. And we'll just start at the compilation of the New Testament again. So I'll go over the stuff that was hard to hear. And then we'll go into how does Marcion fit in. And then some of the examples of how scholars have gotten to where they've gotten to. Agree with them or disagree with them. Smarter dudes than me will go through some of what they say. And then we will also go into what Ghost was asking about, the prophetic patterns, Jonah, Isaiah, and some of the other Messiah foreshadowing in the Old Testament. How does it jive? And how is it cohesive with the Marcion issue, I guess you could call it. Ask AI what? The apostle St. Paul saith, let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. I missed the context there. I'm debating now whether we just run through this right now. Maybe we just will. You can easily trace the Ebionites and Nazarenes, both Torah keeping, Paul rejecting, so obviously anti-Marcion. Joey, a live stream reading of Marcion's gospel would be nice, I think, to follow up on tonight's talk. I mean, I have what's available. We could. Okay, yeah, we're just gonna keep going. Kat just told me she's not ready anyways for bed because we're old and we go to bed really early. I'm just sitting here building a side table, so I'm done. Okay, beautiful. All right, so we talked about Matthias. Okay, so despite all of the research biblical scholars have done, they have never been able to find the actual Q, which we've talked about. It doesn't exist in a physical sense. It's a theory. It's an idea. Not any mention of an early text that would make clear where all the puzzle pieces came from. So we basically, what they do is, how they've done it is how they do other ancient textual reconstruction, where Q is dark matter, where they have all of these texts and say 5 out of 7 texts share 2 verses, and then something else is different. But what's similar all shows that they're using some kind of original source. And so they build that up over time. So then with other texts or in other places in those same texts, they see the similarities again. And when they compile that, they build a theory, or they build a reconstruction of sorts of the original source, that of which we do not actually have. They build it based on these other texts. The idea of doing that, personally, is mind-boggling and probably so incredibly frustrating. But that's how they do it. That's how they do a lot of this stuff that we don't have. The Gospel of Peter, a gospel that in many areas literally and exactly mirrors that of the canonical Gospels, but then deviates with its own traditions and direction, which is the case for a lot of the texts that did not make it into the canon. The Gospel of Thomas is another one, a compilation of sayings of Jesus. Many of these are nearly identical to those of which you'd find in the canonical Gospels, but then it deviates with its own traditions and direction. You could go on. There are a number of them. When we take Matthew, Luke, Peter, Thomas, and then some of the others, and we attempt to compare them to Q or to Mark to try to match up the parallels and make the puzzle pieces fit, we can't. In places you can, and with some you can, partially you can, seemingly, but not enough to be satisfactory. What some scholars believe, careful with the verbiage, the only text that seems to fit for all of them, for the most part, is Marcion's Gospel. So here's an example. In the Gospel of Peter, we have this sequence of 5 verses. The first, the third, and the 5th verses are those which we find in exact parallel to those found in the Synoptic Gospels. That would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The 2nd verse and the 4th verse then deviate from the Synoptic Gospels. The 3 verses that parallel are found to be written probably originally in Marcion's Gospel. When we replace Q with the Gospel of Marcion, it fits the evidence for the synoptic question. The synoptic question is it's a common coined thing that scholars will say. And what they're saying is, why are these Gospels so similar? That's the synoptic question. The synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is not synoptic. It's non-synoptic because it is not the same. It is not similar. It has some similarities, but it diverts pretty heavily. John is pretty wild compared to the first 3. So the synoptic question is, why are the synoptics so similar? And the question of John, why do things parallel so perfectly? But it also answers the question scholars have about non-canonical texts and why even they seem to mirror some ultimate original source material, that which is either Marcion or Q or possibly something else. Another example, the oldest commentary that we know of on what is said to be the Gospel of Luke, attested to by Clement of Alexandria, potentially written by the so-called Gnostic Heracleon in the 2nd century. We only have a fragment given by Clement. So this is something that was written by, quote-unquote, a Gnostic, attested to by Clement of Alexandria. We have a fragment that was given to us through history by Clement of Alexandria. Scholars claim this is not a commentary on Luke, but it is a commentary on the text that we know of given by Tertullian, which is the Gospel of Marcion, because it doesn't seem to fit as a commentary on Luke. Fit that then with the fact that a lot of these scholars believe that Luke was copied in a sense from Marcion. So if then we have a commentary that says it's on Luke, or seems to be by some scholars written on Luke, but doesn't quite fit Luke, but the parts it does fit also happen to fit with the concept of Luke having copied Marcion. It's complicated, and I'm sorry, but I hope I explained it well enough. It's one of a number of cases. It's one of a number of the reasons that people believe this. It seems that those from the 2nd century, Clement, as well as those from the 3rd century, like Tertullian, knew of the Gospel of Marcion, because it seems that they comment on it. If we can follow Marcion within the canonical Gospels, who copied and changed Marcion's Gospel, which is the theory that we're talking about, if they copied and changed Marcion's Gospel, as well as following the Gospel like Peter's text, who also made use of Marcion's Gospel, as well as the Synoptic Gospels, we can assume that we have a very detailed gospel writing tradition that began right after the Second Jewish War, which was how this whole thing started. I hope some things have clicked. This is really, really, really confusing stuff. And so if you're lost, I don't feel bad at all. This is intense. It's a lot. And if you don't have any background in any of this, if this is not stuff you've studied or looked at, if you're not weird and you're interested in this kind of thing, and you're like, oh, this all makes sense, none of this should be easy to grasp. A lot of it should be dang, this is a lot. This is heavy. This is pretty wild, but it's satisfying for sure. I always wonder why we had 3 gospels that were almost the same. Right. It's odd. It's really odd. Important things. Q was agreed upon by most to be one of, if not the original gospel. Second only potentially to Mark. If we extinguish Q, but instead use Marcion's gospel, nothing really is disturbed, and in fact, more light is shed when comparing other gospels to their original source. Therefore, the need for Q becomes irrelevant, and the use of Marcion becomes invaluable. If the synoptics, as well as other non-canonical gospels, use Marcion as their primary source, this would then assert that Marcion's gospel is the original gospel of our Lord, but still draws on other texts that are being passed around, and that's important. I don't believe any scholars are saying Marcion wrote the gospel. The gospel is the production of this dude who rented ships to the Roman government. I've never heard that. The idea is that he compiled it, is that through oral and then early written tradition, he was able to compile this. Just to be super clear. The gospel from which the canonical gospels are written then into existence. Theory again being, Marcion hated. Obviously, 2nd, 3rd century theologians knew about the gospel because they commented on it. Called him a heretic. Probably destroyed the texts. But more than likely kept them for them. And then this is where we get a rich gospel writing tradition begins based on what was possibly this original compilation of the very earliest stories about Jesus Christ. If this is true, our Bible's canonical gospels are secondary or third source material, which is something that would be really hard for people to admit. And I understand why. And it's okay for that to be hard to admit. It's not okay to, in my opinion, it's not okay to ignorantly and blindly accept something if it makes no sense at all, or if the evidence goes in a different direction, especially if it does not actually disturb the faith. My opinion. These are not things we're taught in Sunday school, obviously. All 4 canonical gospels share similarities with what is thought to be the original source, or a primary source, whether that be Q, Marcion, or something entirely different. Each of these gospels lays a similar foundation and then emphasizes different things. An obvious expression of the subjective individual that wrote them. And that is important, because that is something, if you've never done, you should do a critical analysis of the Gospels. With technology now, you can read Gospels side by side. And there exists websites and, at the very least, I don't know if you call it a program. I guess it's still a website, but where you can actually read the Gospels side by side at the same story, where you don't have to like be verse for verse, if that makes sense. So where the stories mirror, if one's chapter 2 and one's chapter 7, they'll both be together regardless because they're the same story. So you can read the actual stories paralleled, and you can see where they differ and where they're identical. It would be a good thing to do if you've never done it, especially after this, if this has caused you to think. Rebranded it the Gospel of Luke. Yeah, bro. And then you get into Luke Acts, then pull Acts in here, baby girl, and things get just absolutely wild. Things get even more wild when we start going into Acts. Yeah, rebranded it the Gospel of Luke and calling him a heretic. Paul introduced a second gospel. Jude says to defend the faith once and for all delivered to the saints. What are you referring to with that gospel? Hey, Jude. Galatians 2, Paul breaks with the apostles. Paul says he was apostle to the Gentiles. Jesus gave the Great Commission to the 11. Am I just slow? Michelle, I'm really glad you're here, but I am struggling to keep up with what we're talking about. I said, was there a deeper agenda for destroying the text? It's hard to say. I don't know, right? I have no idea. I don't think so, though. I don't think so. It seems like something, the odd thing is like, this is no different than what continues to happen. This continues to happen in all of Christianity. The only thing that doesn't really change is the text. Right? But like Christianity itself, the culture, the churches, it's all still doing this. We're still doing this. We've just kind of agreed, like, don't touch the Bible. Leave the Bible alone. Except not really. There are still like groups of Christians who read other texts. The Catholics include the Apocrypha. Other Christian sects include the Apocrypha, as well as some of the other texts. And Gnostics still exist, who are just Christians. They just believe in different things. Significant things, to be fair, but different things. And you could say the difference between a non-denominational Christian and a Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox is pretty drastic. It's pretty drastic. They believe the same, like, what you'd call essential doctrine, but they don't really agree on anything else. So is there a deeper agenda for destroying the text? I think people just want it to be right. I'm big on conspiracy. I don't think there was one. I think it's truly just a matter of religion makes people crazy. It's what Paul was talking about very, very early before any of this stuff happened. Paul was scolding churches more than anything else, it seemed like. They were already just messing everything up. So is it crazy to think that these proto-Orthodox Christians thought that they had the truth? It sounds like today. Protestants have the truth. The Catholics have the truth. If one of these churches today could destroy the Bible and keep the things they want, they would. In part, the Protestant Reformation did something similar to that. So no, I don't personally think there's any deeper agenda. I think this is just what Christians do. I think Christians are arrogant and they're self-righteous, and they all think they're right, and they're delusional enough to think that of all the nuance and possibility of what is theologically true, they all, for some reason, are arrogant enough to be like, no, I have it figured out, which is just asinine. But that's all I think it is. That's just me, though. A gospel of circumcision and the gospel of the uncircumcised. He didn't really teach two gospels, though. Paul was pretty consistent. After Paul dispute with Peter, James sent him to sacrifice in the temple, Acts 21. Acts is tough, though. But regardless, Paul was pretty consistent about what he taught. Theology is ableist. Okay, now I just think you're trolling, so now I'm going to ignore you. because I don't think that can be real. If that's real, I'm sorry, but I have lost what is going on here. I'd like to hear about this second gospel of Paul. Paul was pretty consistent. He was even consistent when he was teaching things that were not consistent. He consistently explained kind of like what he was doing. All right, this is the closing though. Things to remember, things to keep in mind, especially if we're going to do part 2 or go into some of the prophetic stuff. Christianity was being spread verbally, stories only. So you had these stories being orally passed around. We have no known written accounts early on. However, we know that there were things there. We just don't have any. Q, Marcion, whatever. They existed. Things existed. Jesus' followers, as described in the Gospels and the Pauline epistles, are what we'd call, I suppose today, like blue collar, and could be assumed to be, in every possible way, completely illiterate. They were not reading, and they certainly were not writing. This is why, likely, it took so long to get written accounts of Jesus Christ. Paul's epistles came first. We have no reason to believe the gospel writers who produced their gospels later, knew Paul's letters. We have no reason to believe that. The gospels do not necessarily draw in any way off of Paul. In fact, they conflict in many places. We certainly have no reason to think Paul knew of the gospels. One, because scholarship is pretty on board with each other that the gospels came later, some much, some less, but later. And because, again, the Gospels conflict with much of Paul. So if the Gospel writers had Paul, his epistles, then they probably would have made it more cohesive, because there is conflict between a lot of what Paul taught and a lot of what specifically like Luke and Matthew taught. This is what makes sense of a lot of those contradictions, is that there was no communication between Paul or Paul's epistles and the gospel writers and the gospels. Example, the law must be followed. Matthew and Luke. Matthew specifically, heavy on Jewish law. Paul, the law is dead. Paul consistently taught that we are not under the law, that the law is dead now through fulfillment of Jesus. This is the most obvious and good example, is that if you're honest, reading through the Gospels and reading through Paul, there is no possible way to say that they do not conflict. The Gospel writers, a few of them, clearly say you need to follow the law. The Jewish elements are really heavy. They're obvious. And the gymnastics Christian pastors have to do to account for that is comical. It's clear. They were Jewish authors, and they were pushing Jewish elements into the Gospels. On the other side of that, you have Paul, who is very anti-Jewish custom, very anti-Jewish elements, and was very clear, no, there will be none of that. We are under a new covenant. Jesus came for this. We don't do this. And then you have Marcion, who is quite possibly maybe a Jew himself, who is disturbed by the Jewish God in history, so then becomes a Christian. Compiles the New Testament that included 10 of Paul's letters, omitting the pastoral epistles because they were seen as fraudulent by Marcion, as well as many current scholars today. We talked about that. Marcion is fascinated by Paul because Paul primarily writes in opposition to Jewish law and customs. And Marcion rejects Jewish law and customs. So this fits perfectly together and makes a heck of a lot of sense. That's all I got. That's everything. And I know it's a lot, and I'm sorry. But it's interesting stuff. Even if it's wrong, 70%. The 30% is very interesting, and the 30% is worth understanding, or at least having some kind of understanding about. But I think there's a more than 50% possibility that the Marcion thing makes sense. I think it's just really hard to feel confident about because there's just not so much to go off of. But what there is so much to go off of is that the Gospels absolutely had a source. Undoubtedly had a source. And we're pulling from somewhere. That's my 2 cents. All right, I'm gonna hang around for like a minute or two, and then I am going to go to sleep because I am old. Wait, I thought I knew what she was talking about. Not anymore. Michelle, we love you, but you're confusing. These comments are ableist because I don't understand every single one of them, and I don't understand everything. Yeah, it seems like nonsense. Saul Paul existed, that's for sure. We owe organized Christianity to him, although I'm pretty sure he didn't intend it to become the empire's official religion. That's very well said. I am 100% on board with that. Really appreciate your thoughts. It's a massive rabbit hole. It is arguably the biggest rabbit hole that exists. Yeah, it's very interesting. And I'm sure we'll dabble back into it again soon. I'll put something related to this on the poll, but I think I'm gonna decide again for next week, and I think we'll talk about the Gospels a little bit, because I feel like I opened a can of worms, and I don't find it kind to do that and then just like walk away. So I think next Tuesday we will sit and kind of dissect the Gospels. When were they written? What do we know about them? What's up with Q? Stuff like that, and kind of get more context on all of that. Patricia, think about it, but do not stress about it, please, for the love of God. Don't stress. Don't stress. And when you're struggling, I would recommend praying more than doing anything else. Prayer does not rely on the Bible in any way whatsoever. I think we can start calling ourselves Marcionist, right, Ghost? No shot. I just walked in the smack end of this. Craig Harlow. You did, my friend. You did. I'm sorry. Roll it back. Roll it back. All right. Well, for Craig, and I suppose Michelle and anybody else who watches this later, we have a Discord. If you like stuff like this and like to talk to people who are super smart, smarter than me, then I would go to Discord. There's a link pinned to the top of the live chat. There is a link in the description of all the videos. We do a handful of live streams every week. The next one is on Thursday, and that is a non-canonical text. We're reading the Book of Giants right now, which has been really interesting. That's on a different YouTube channel, so not this one. That would be on at Live Bible Study right here. There is a link in Discord, though, so if you go to the Discord, each event has a link to the proper YouTube channel. Saturday, we're either going to do games or a live stream or just games. Saturday's up in the air. But every Sunday we do the canon. We're reading the Book of Job right now, and then next Tuesday we'll do a topic discussion again. And this coming Tuesday, we're going to talk about the Gospels because of tonight and how mentally wrecking it is. We will break down the Gospels, everything there is to know about the canonical Gospels. So that'll be Tuesday. But if you jump in Discord, everything's really easy to find. It's just a good group of people. Like it sells itself. But it is free. Live Bible Study. Subscribe to that one. Go over there so you can be there for those streams. And then I did forget to show you guys this, so I'll show you this and then I'm going to get off. This is the text, right? So you have the Evangelion. That's what the text was called. And this would be the gospel itself. And then you have the epistles. So you had to the Galatians, the Corinthians, 1 and 2, Romans, Thessalonians, 1 and 2, Laodiceans, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. Girl, it is time for bed. I should have shown you this sooner. That was my intention, but here it is at least. You can search for this, or actually I'll throw a link in the Discord. So if anybody's interested in looking through it, you can. It's all available here. All of it. So you can kind of rifle through it if you so choose. I appreciate it, Mikkel. I'm trying to do more. I'm trying to invest more. If we're going to do it, I want to do it all the way. So thank you. Michelle's just going. Michelle, Just will not stop. I also want to know more about the history of John's Gospel. We will do all of them. Yeah, John's Gospel is super interesting because it's the one like sore thumb. It's the one that just like doesn't quite, not that it shouldn't be there, that's not what I'm saying, but it's odd. It is the odd man out. It is the weird kid on the playground that's picking his nose in the corner talking about kind of crazy stuff. Don't forget to like this mind-blowing discussion. Thank you, David. Yeah, do YouTube stuff, guys. And when I shut the live off, if you can hang out for 10 seconds and then leave a regular comment, it helps. It helps. And then we get more people in here. Like Michelle. Slight sarcasm. But I love you, Michelle. We all love you. I just genuinely don't understand what you're saying. And I don't know if you're doing it on purpose or not. So I'm trying to be as polite as possible. That's why it's my favorite gospel. Yeah, I mean, it's the most interesting one for sure. And it's the one that's kind of different, right? Mark is pretty plain, but good information. John is like, whoa, girl, what happened? What happened? Everything got wild. And it's interesting, the sequence. And I won't spoil it. We'll talk about it next week. I am out. I'm going to bed. I love you guys. Everybody have a good night. If you're not in Discord, join Discord and come hang out with us because we're fun. I think. Love y'all. Night.